Anybody who's on now, can you hear me? I'm seeing 22 viewers right now. Can anyone hear me? Better than last time? All right, we'll start in about 5 minutes then. Make sure go ahead and sign in on the Google Doc. Make sure you sign in under your class period. Nice to be joined by both Willards. Glad I no longer sound like I'm underwater or some sort of devil. You're a funny guy, Scott. Eddie, that email, that's fine. Just give me a report on what happens with the Senate when you watch them. Scott, if you had paid attention last night, this morning wouldn't have been a surprise for you. All right, it's 2:00. You guys ready to get started? I'm just trying to gauge how much of a delay there is. So when you hear the word this, type this. All right, so it looks like we're running on. It looks like we're running on a little bit of a delay. So I'll just try to anticipate that when I ask questions, there might be periods of awkward silence where maybe I'll just type questions that I have for you guys instead of actually saying them. So just to give you a heads up for the rest of this week, I'm guessing based on forecasts that, and again, you can't take this one to the bank yet, but we're probably going to get out early tomorrow, which means that 7th period won't be able to review with me. And Thursday is also looking kind of sketchy. So we're going to play the testing by ear at this point. Don't be surprised if the test ends up being Thursday, Friday, or Friday, Monday. But I'm going to have to push forward with your stuff for period 8, so you'll start to see the work for period 8 go on a little further. Scott, you really need hobbies with the Dora comment there. So let's go ahead and get started with World War II. This is the Homefront version. Last time we did this, we talked about more of World War II abroad. Now we're going to talk about what was happening in good old America. So with the Homefront in World War II, the first thing you're going to notice is that there are a lot of presidents that fight in World War II, a lot of future presidents. And almost every single one of these future presidents is going to make sure that they run on the credential that is their service in World War II. And you're going to see these presidents are going to span a very, very long period of time, from Eisenhower in the 50s all the way through George H.W. Bush, who's going to serve up until 1992. The World War II generation in American history is kind of a big deal. They've been called the greatest generation. That's based off of several books and reportings of the generation. And a lot of it is because of the stuff that they did, the stuff that we're going to talk about, in addition to all the things that happen with fighting abroad, a lot of the things they do on the home front are things that we might not think of doing so much today. I mean, there's currently a two-front war going on in Afghanistan and Iraq, and unless we have family members in the service, how many of us have actually had to change our lives in any way, shape, or form? A lot of people think that that's been a very negative impact on the United States, the fact that we no longer feel the pain of war. We send our troops off and they're just kind of gone, and then when they come back, we expect them to just kind of come back to things the way they were, and life kind of goes on without them. So as Hitler starts his march in Germany, once he takes over Poland, the United States is still committed to isolationism. This is big from World War I and the fallout from World War I. We do not want to get dragged into European affairs. And FDR, at that time, he's in his second term as president. He's largely been dealing with the Great Depression. Things are slightly better, but not a whole lot better. And then Hitler happens, and he's got to decide what to do. The United States clearly does not want to get involved in a European war if they don't have to. We also don't want to explicitly choose sides. So instead of aligning with the Allies out of the gate, Congress first passes what's called the Cash and Carry Act in 1939, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It replaces the previous Neutrality Act, which said that we wouldn't join either side, nor would we sell to anybody in Europe involved in the war. The Cash and Carry Act says that as long as someone involved in the war comes to pick their goods up and pays in cash, we were allowed to trade with them. We're still kind of sort of staying neutral with the Cash and Carry Act. Germany essentially can't afford to ship across the Atlantic. They don't have the naval power, nor do they have the naval power to protect the shipping, nor do they have the cash on hand to purchase weapons, purchase ships, etc., etc. So while we're remaining neutral in theory, we're definitely only trading with the Allies at this point because they're the only ones that can afford this. Also at this point, you're going to have what's called the America First Committee. This is going to be a group that it kind of in response to Cash and Carry that's 800,000 strong, and it is the largest anti-war group in American history. They're going to be very active until Pearl Harbor happens, and once Pearl Harbor happens, they kind of see the writing on the wall and they dissolve their group. In 1940, FDR declares the United States the arsenal of democracy. He promises to send weapons. At this point, he's basically choosing a side. But he promises that he'll send weapons and implements of war, but he won't send any troops. He will not commit to American boots on the ground. Still a popular move today with the war on ISIS. Barack Obama has said repeatedly that, we'll do all kinds of things. We just won't put any boots on the ground. That's kind of the idea behind the arsenal of democracy, where we're going to send weapons, we're going to send warships, we're going to send other stuff, but not troops. This really ramps up in 1941. Hitler is still expanding. The Japanese are becoming more aggressive. And in 1941, the Lend-Lease Act is passed. The Lend-Lease Act says that we're going to send military supplies in exchange for the use of bases around the world. Essentially, if we're going to join the war, you give us bases, we'll give you supplies. Note it's lend-lease, which, when you lend something to someone or you lease something to someone, you expect to get it back at the end. Some of the supplies are returned at the end of the war, but for the most part, people keep them, or they're at the bottom of the ocean somewhere. And this completely ends any any semblance of neutrality on the part of the United States. We're clearly on board with the Allies at this point, which is obviously not going to go over too well with the Germans. And just to see the scope of the Lend-Lease Act, these are the amounts in 1941 that we give to the different allied countries, and that total at the bottom is essentially what we give away in today's dollars. That's $48 trillion for you math majors out there. Just a whole lot of money given away. And I will, at this point, wait for questions for about a minute before moving on to the next topic, let you guys catch up with notes. Scott just asked with the Lend-Lease Act how much of that we got back. We don't get a whole lot back. It's essentially the idea behind, if you lend someone your car to go into a demolition derby, how much of your car are you expecting to get back in one piece? So not a whole lot. Rebecca asked how much, if we need to know specifically how much money for each country. No, Rebecca, you just have to know the general idea behind it. As far as the South American participation, I believe there's limited troops and some money, but not 100% on that. I'll jump on the Googles for you on that one. According to the Wikipedias, we want to make sure we protect the Panama Canal from the Axis powers, so we're going to make sure that they're taken care of, and that Brazil is very close, relatively close to Africa. Therefore, we want to make sure that they're being lent support. And Argentina and Chile, there's actually going to be, after the war, some Nazis are going to flee to those countries. And the Axis powers are actually going to have a big influence on them. Sophia, FDR's reputation, Austin, you wrote 3 words, so I'm not quite sure what your question is with cash and carry there. Sophia asked about FDR's reputation and how it changes once we decide to get fully involved in the war. People are largely behind it. He gets a little bit of a boost in popularity. And we'll also talk about how, this is what really gets us out of the Great Depression. The New Deal is a great stopgap, but not quite a cure-all. But once we get into the war, it's the whole economy is behind the war effort. And a lot of people get out of the Depression thanks to the war. Austin, cash and carry was that we would give supplies. We would sell supplies to countries fighting in the war as long as they came to pick them up and paid cash for them. We were not allowed to sell on credit, and we were not allowed to ship anything. That way, if one of our ships got sunk, it wouldn't get us pulled into the war. So the idea behind cash and carry was that pretty much only allies could afford it. They were the only ones with cash. The Germans didn't have any cash. So as long as they picked it up, gave us cash, we would give them weapons and food and whatnot for the war. All right, I'm going to move ahead to the next slide. We discussed a little bit more of this before. This is with the war in the Pacific. Just a couple of you don't need to know battles. You don't need to know dates or anything like that. Battles and how they lead to the end of the war. These are just 4/5 things that almost the every American should know type thing. So the Doolittle raids happen in 1942, and this is when we do an air raid on Tokyo itself. Japan thinks that we don't quite have a lot of resolve. That will really come into play with the Battle of Midway. The Doolittle raids show that Japan is actually vulnerable to American attacks. We actually send planes. We bombed Tokyo just as the Germans had bombed London at one point. And it's just a chink in the armor for the Japanese. And a big morale boost after Pearl Harbor. I mean, we had our entire Navy destroyed by this country, and this is just us saying, hey, we can do something like that too. The Bataan Death March we talked about before. This is the forced march of the American troops in the Philippines, where many of them die. These are all prisoners of war. And you can see the depiction here of, some of them as, once they're too weak to walk or just as a point are simply beheaded in plain view of the rest of the troops. June of 42 is a major U.S. naval victory. That's the Battle of Midway. This is where all of their assumptions about the United States are kind of proven wrong. We destroy a large portion of their Navy. Their ability to go on the offensive at this point is very, very much hurt. They largely have to fight a defensive war at this point, which is going to still be a heck of a war to fight because they basically what happens is you can see on this slide here, they've entrenched themselves in a lot of really small islands around the Pacific. And you have to get them off those islands in order to force them to retreat. And one of the major battles here, one of the most famous battles in American history in the Pacific theater, is the Battle of Iwo Jima. And it's a great kind of case in point of both the Japanese resolve and what the Americans are really facing. Iwo Jima, the Americans have completely surrounded, but they can only attack from one side. Iwo Jima is essentially an island with a small beach and lots of mountains. And when the Americans attack, the Japanese, they can't retreat. They either have to surrender or win. And based on the sheer volume of American troops, they have no shot at winning. So when the Americans attack Iwo Jima, we capture virtually no prisoners of war. The only ones that we capture are those that are knocked essentially unconscious in the fight or are wounded to the point that they can't do anything else. Otherwise, at both Iwo Jima and Okinawa, there is no escape for the Japanese troops on the island. They are either going to blow themselves up with grenades around American troops, or they're just going to make sure they go down fighting. Very few Japanese are willing to be taken alive. They consider it dishonorable to be captured. One of the most famous images out of Iwo Jima is this picture here with the flag raising. This happens on Mount Suribachi, which is one of the mountains on Iwo Jima. And this is 5 American troops, and it's an interesting collection. One is a medic who, refuses to fight in the war. Another guy by the name of Ira Hayes is a Native American that's fighting in the war. And these guys are, this picture is taken, you don't need to know the mountain name or the photographer. This is just background. The photographer that takes this picture is a war photographer by the name of Joe Rosenthal. And you've got to remember, then when you took pictures, it's not like you could, flip it over, look at the camera and see what you got. He had no idea he had captured this image. There's kind of a legend to it that he was actually falling over backwards when he snapped the image. And this is actually the second flag raising on Mount Suribachi. We had already raised a flag claiming victory, but it was a smaller flag, so this was kind of the bigger flag to show the Japanese that we really, really captured it. The 5 guys in this image are shortly thereafter going to be pulled from the war. They're going to be sent home to do tours for bonds, which we'll talk about later. Okinawa happened shortly after Iwo Jima. This is the bloodiest battle in the Pacific. It happens just before we dropped the 2 atomic bombs in Japan. This is a very important airstrip. It's going to allow us access to Japan, although there's debate over whether or not we actually needed to fight the battle, because we were able to reach Japan from where we were, but it did prove to be an important refueling spot. Iwo Jima also largely led by the Marines, so big victory for the Marine Corps. I will pause for a minute for Pacific Front questions. Dom asked why America didn't just take Japan and forget about the little islands. The little islands, essentially, Dom, are their offensive front. Almost, it's like their offensive linemen, because to get to Japan, you need to have a couple of bases within reach of your planes, and you want to be relatively close so your planes have enough fuel to not just get to Japan and drop a couple bombs, but also fight if need be. So if you don't take those closer in islands, you don't have a place to refuel, you don't have a place to launch attacks from, and also the shorter the flight, the more likely, or the less likely you are to be spotted on radar. Lucy asked to go over the Bataan Death March again. The Bataan Death March, all you need to know with that, Lucy, is that the Japanese marched American prisoners of war just basically further inland to avoid them being recaptured. And you just need to know that lots of American troops die in the march. It's very barbaric treatment of American troops. Dan asked about why it was dishonorable to get captured. That was just kind of the way society was in Japan. That was the way the Japanese viewed that you went down fighting, that you did not surrender, that you fought to the end. It has a lot to do with the mindset behind why we dropped the atomic bomb. It was just a part of Japanese culture at the time. You'll find that some of their military leaders, rather than take part in the surrender, actually would use a process called hirikiri to commit suicide, because they viewed it as so dishonorable to surrender. And with that, essentially what you do is cut your insides out, and it's a very painful way to die that takes a lot of time. Scott asked about the Chinese base where we could have bombed Japan. We could not have comfortably sat in a Chinese base because the Japanese were into the Chinese mainland to some degree. We also would not have been able to apply. You can see that line of Japanese expansion on the map that's on up now. We couldn't comfortably resupply a Chinese base early in the war. All right, so let's move on a little bit to World War II in America. And this is kind of the lives of everyday Americans and how everyday Americans are affected. First off, once the war starts and we're really into it, we reach what's called full employment. Full employment, and that means that for statistical purposes, everyone can find a job. And when everyone can find a job, that's a good way to get out of a Great Depression. So you can see here, this is Rosie the Riveter in this poster. If you've looked in the back of my classroom, you'll see one of these. This was the symbol of women in the workforce during World War II. Many, many women went to work to participate in the war effort, and having a job in World War II meant you were participating in the war effort. They wanted everybody to buy into this war, and to the degree that there will be a draft instituted, this will be one of the least dodged drafts in American history. Usually if you were drafted, you went. It was just kind of the mindset of the time that you were making the world safe for everyone else. As far as rationing goes, rationing is a big propaganda push to keep people involved in the war effort. So here, we're going to try some questions for you guys here. Somebody off of my period 8 class, so my 1-8 class, tell me what this is supposed to mean here. The do with less so they'll have enough. Give me a little bit of a document analysis on that one. Very good, Rebecca. What you don't use will go to support the truth. Deal with it, Eric. Picture analysis is good for you. Um, yeah, the idea here is, if you give something up at home, and again, this is the idea that even if you can't fight in the war, you're still a part of the war. And over here, you can see this ration coupon. And the idea behind the ration coupon, again, it kind of keeps you in line with making sure that you're only getting what you need in order to help the troops. Let's have someone from period 4 address this I'm in this fight too piece. Somebody from period 4, tell me what's going on with that one. No worries, Brianna T. But good answer. That's right, Jess. Pictures and oil. Corinne, you're half right, but look at the picture a little bit more. How is she saving energy? What's that a picture of? There you go, Kevin. She's turning down the heat. She's adjusting her thermostat so she's able to save energy for the war effort. So again, rationing, a way to get everyone in the war involved. The other big way that people were involved in the war was through savings bonds. And savings bonds, again, you have this push like, are you doing enough to be involved in the war? You've got the imagery of Uncle Sam's saying that essentially you buying bonds is going to get us in the military. And someone from period 7 now, tell me how a bond works. How does a war bond or really any bond work? Again, that's a period 7 question with the war bonds and how they work. Good, Sophia. That is pretty much the explanation for how bonds work. It's a way that the government borrows money. Essentially, you give money to the government to pay for whatever they're raising money for. In this case, it's a war effort. You can have bond drives for bridges and many, many other things. In this case, you're paying for the war, and you then are given money back when the time comes, depending on how long it takes the bond to mature. You get money back with interest. You can still buy bonds today for pretty much anything, and it's considered to be one of the safest investments in the world to invest in the American government. For bond drives, they would get famous people involved. Charles Lindbergh was very prominent in bond drives. Here you have the flag raisers. They would go around the country to different events. They would recreate the raising of the flags at these events. And, some of it was kind of sad. Ira Hayes was fairly discriminated against. He was the Native American in the group. He ends up actually dying penniless in a puddle. He was a severe alcoholic, and he ended up drowning in a roadside ditch on one of these bond tours. You'll also see they turn to Dr. Seuss for some of these war bonds drives here. A lot of very what we consider today to be racist cartoons. And here you can see what they were pushing for. So this $1 out of every 10 idea that you gave 10% of your money to the U.S. government. And anybody from any class can answer this. Where does this 10% idea, this giving 10% to the government, what are they borrowing from here? Like, who else uses that idea? Yes, Jay, Captain America actually is created for these World War II bond drives. And yes, Scott and Corinne, the idea behind this $1 out of every 10, this is tithing. This is the most Christian churches expected you to give 10% of your income to the church. To kind of play off of this Japanese racism, Dan, the question was where the 10% out of your income came from. We discussed this a little bit before, just a little bit more background information on this. Yes, just Lincoln's plan was the 10% plan, but that's not where the 10% to bonds idea came from. The Japanese, again, this just goes to, why didn't we relocate Germans? Why didn't we relocate Italians? This goes to just kind of the ability to recognize a Japanese person more easily than you can an Irish or an Italian or a German person. With Japanese internment, this was done in the name of national security. It was because we thought that people of Japanese ancestry were going to give secrets from the United States back to their home country. Not a single Japanese person was ever found to be sharing state secrets with the enemy. In fact, many Japanese Americans are actually serving in the war while their families are locked up in these war relocation camps. Same thing goes for people of German and Irish descent. We are going to be prejudiced against Germans and Italians for quite a while after World War II. In fact, the Irish for a time make the Italians go to church in basements. The Irish and Italians both tended to be Catholic. If an Italian came to an Irish church, they would hold a separate mass for the Italians in the basement of the church. Again, the delicious irony, as the Irish were a generation earlier, the ones being discriminated against, but they're using what the countries of their ancestry are doing to discriminate against them in the present. Scott, that doesn't necessarily mean they were good spies. Virtually everything from World War II has been declassified at this point. And when we took over the Japanese and German governments for them, they basically had to disclose everything, and we would have figured out if they were just good spies at this point. It takes us 40 years to recognize maybe we shouldn't have done this. And in 1988, Reagan is going to sign the Civil Liberties Act. This is going to give $20,000 per survivor to people locked in the internment camps. It's going to total $1.6 billion. So, kind of a sorry for taking your freedom for a time, but, here's $20,000. Just our way of apologizing. The last bit that you have to know for period 7, this is kind of your prelude to period 8 and the Cold War. The Truman Doctrine, remember FDR dies and Truman becomes president. The Truman Doctrine is instated in 1947. This says that we will do everything we can to prevent communism from spreading. We've moved on to a new enemy now. The Germans have been taken care of. The Japanese, Italians have been taken care of. Fascism is no longer the enemy. So we moved from a far right political spectrum enemy to a far left political spectrum enemy. Anna asks, what type of treatment did the Japanese receive in these internment camps? Anna, we're going to watch a video about this tomorrow. George Takei, Star Trek dude and internet icon, was actually held in one of these internment camps. So we're going to watch an interview of his tomorrow kind of describing it, but not well. I mean, we basically put these camps the same place we put Indian reservations. So it's either extremely cold or extremely hot. We give them, they're essentially treated like prisoners of war. Darius asked about the presidents that served in World War II and how influential they are. Of those, Eisenhower is an extremely important general. In the army during World War II, he's basically leading the forces in Europe. The rest of them serve in various aspects, not necessarily as generals during the war. As far as impactful presidencies, 2 of them you have to do in-depth presidential outlines for. That would be Reagan and Johnson. John F. Kennedy is considered a very impactful president. And then you also have the scandal of Nixon, the irregularity of Carter, and then George H.W. Bush. People are starting to appreciate him as president a little more as time has gone on. Dom, the far right to far left, fascism is considered a far right, extremely conservative, economically form of governments, and communism is considered a far left form of government where everybody owns everything. So our enemy just kind of shifted from being someone considered extremely conservative to someone being considered extremely liberal, at least from an economic standpoint. And Lucy, the Irish Catholics discriminated against the Italian Catholics. The Irish and Italians together would discriminate against the Japanese. There was basically a hierarchy of discrimination with Japanese at the bottom because, again, just as throughout our history, the Japanese are more recognizable based on the way that they look. So back to the Truman Doctrine. Again, this is stating that we will stop communism from spreading at all costs. This is what is going to officially start the Cold War, which is the Cold War. All you need to know about it right now is it's the United States being quote unquote at war with the USSR without directly firing a shot at each other. They would fight through Vietnam, Korea. They would fight by trying to lend money to countries, but they never directly fire a shot at each other. Pretty much everything we cover in period 8 is going to be based out of the Cold War. The United Nations is officially going to start in 1945. The idea behind it is to be a League of Nations that actually works. The degree to which they work is debatable. They're very good at writing strongly worded letters. The biggest weakness is that the 5 Security Council countries, the United States, the USSR, now Russia, China, the British, and the French all have veto power. So if anything is passed that those 5 countries disagree with, it goes away. Again, that's the United States, the Soviet Union / Russia, China, France, and England. If they disagree with any legislation that's going to go through the United Nations, they can veto it. But the idea is to get countries working together to avoid war, which you could argue that they are much better at that than the League of Nations, since we didn't go into World War III again 20 years after World War II ended. The Berlin airlift is a plan to give goods to the people of Berlin. If you remember last time, we talked about how Germany is split into 4 sections that are administered by the Allied nations. The eastern area is administered by the Soviets, and the British, French, and English take Western Germany. But then they also separate Berlin into 4 sections, and you have a Soviet portion, and then an American, French, and British portion. And Berlin just happens to be in East Germany. So in the middle of East Germany, you have Berlin with sections administered by Americans, French, and British, completely cut off from the rest of Germany because they're in Soviet-held territory. So we are going to send goods directly into Berlin and have them land in the democratically controlled parts of Berlin to get them goods. This is going to be a 2-year project before the Soviets eventually let us open a supply line there. Last thing you need to know for this time period is the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan sees us give $13 billion in AIDS. That's $170 billion in today's money. $13 billion in aid to essentially war-torn countries in Europe. And based on World War I, somebody tell me why we did that. Why do we? It's a loan that is not often paid back. Why did we do that? Dan asks about this map on the right. This map on the right is how much money is given to countries in Europe in order to get their economies running again. And all of you are pretty well hitting the nail on the head with the idea behind the Marshall Plan. Yeah, we wanted to avoid another war. We wanted to avoid another depression. Most of the loans given out under the Marshall Plan are forgiven. One of the few countries to completely pay them back is actually Germany, and that was a point of pride. We actually forgave the debt a couple of times, but Germany insisted on repaying it. All right, so any final questions from today? Rebecca, the Marshall Plan was us giving money / loans to war-torn countries in Europe. That's what the graphic on the slideshow shows. By the way, on this graphic, all the areas in gray, with the exception of Spain, all the areas in gray are Soviet-controlled. And Rebecca, we gave that money for all the reasons listed in the chat here. I'm sorry you couldn't get enough sleep before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Dan. Lucy asked, did rations actually help anyone? Yes and no. Could we have fought World War II without rationing and still won? Probably. But the one thing that rations did, you've got to remember, is it got everyone involved in the war. You felt like by rationing, you were contributing to the war effort. Um, so some of it was as simple as women couldn't wear pantyhose because they weren't being produced because factories were using pantyhose. Factories were producing other goods. So while rationing maybe wasn't 100% necessary to win on the battlefield, it at least got the whole country involved, probably allowed people to contribute more to bond drives, and therefore is going to help everybody out. Eric, I'm not aware of us giving money to Switzerland, but Switzerland does have a little bar on that bar graph, so you can hit the Googles and find out the answer to that one. Anna, the Soviets didn't gain control of Spain. Remember, Spain had just gone through their own civil war. Franco is in power in Spain, and we don't get along with him. So they're not under Soviet control. The Soviet control is all the areas on the east. Yeah, the Spanish are under their own independent control. And Scott, if you ever tweeted anything entertaining, maybe I would retweet it. Any other questions? I figured you would enjoy that, Austin. All right, so Dan is sleepy, so let's go ahead and wrap this up. We will. I will see you tomorrow. Seventh period. If you have fourth lunch, might not be a bad idea to drop into fourth period APUS history. We are in room 204 because I have a sinking suspicion I won't see you guys tomorrow. If I don't, pay attention to Haiku for everything that's going to happen with the test and whatnot. But right now, let's assume tomorrow is a review day. Rebecca, what's the confusion about the homework tonight? I'm going to log off here and just answer questions in chat from this point forward.